Today is the second week in a third-week series that is based on the three faces of God. And this is an idea that was introduced by Ken Wilber. How many of you are familiar with this great mind? He's written a number of incredible books, one of which is called Integral Spirituality. And he approaches life through the perspective of a scientist or a philosopher, if you will, a genius, quite frankly. But he did write a book called Integral Spirituality. And what he realized is that in most of the religious traditions, most spiritual traditions relate to God in one or two ways. And these ways are the same ways that we relate to everything. They have to do with the first person, second person, third person perspective. By that we mean the first person is the I that is speaking. The second person is the you that is being spoken to. And the third person is the it that we could be speaking about. And that in order to communicate, we need all three of those. That if we tried to leave out any of those perspectives of first, second, third person, that we really couldn't communicate and be in relationship with. And in religion, what tends to happen is some religions relate to God as the great infinite cosmic web of life, all that is. That's called the third person, the sort of the it, the bigger than. Some religions tend to relate to God as the beloved, our Father which art in heaven, the thou. All of these represent that embodiment. We'll talk about this in a little bit. And then some religions tend to relate to God and like the yogic path in some ways tends to relate to God through the great I amness within. So it's God within us. But what Ken Wilber began to realize that it's not an either or. And that unless any religious tradition is including all of those, then perhaps we are closing off a portion of the way that we could be in relationship, a way that we could experience all that is. And so the Reverend Paul Smith, would you give me this slide? He took the work of Ken Wilber and he has a book that's coming out in September titled The Three Faces of God. Is your God big enough, close enough, you enough? It's the title of our series. I was so excited I couldn't wait for his book, so I just did it before the book. We'll read the book after and see what it says. But here you go. This is my version. So Jesus, if we look at the life of Jesus in relationship to the God as he understood God, and remember, Jesus grew up in the Jewish tradition, and so the way he related to the Creator was so different that it's actually what got him killed. So the first way Jesus related to God was he talked about God. Remember, he would say things like, consider the lilies, how they're clothed and they're fed, and that the God was this cosmic, great, bigger than God. The next slide, Jesus also related and spoke to God. Very personal. He would go away and pray. That having a personal relationship with the Creator, he dared call God Abba, Abba Amma, the Father, which was radical in that time. So he personalized God, which was blasphemy in his time, basically. And then the third thing that he did, well, this was really the biggest blasphemy, is he identified as God. He said, the Father and I are one. That if you've seen the Father, you've seen me. And the disciples said, where is the Father? Is the Father hiding? We don't see the Father. And he said, you're missing it, that the Father and I are one. And so he had this way of relating to the cosmic, all that is God, about God, God in the third person. He was equally comfortable communing and talking to God as the second person, the intimate God. And then he was just as comfortable relating to the first person that I am. Do you not know that ye are the temple of God? He said that we are this. And so we're in this 3-week exploration to look at these three faces of God that we may open ourselves. Because in unity, you tend to hear, or unity, Centers for Spiritual Living, religious science, New Thought, you tend to hear more about the I amness, the Christ within, the divinity within. We're very comfortable, as a general rule, with the first one, that God is within us. And pretty comfortable with the great cosmic God out, beyond, God in the trees and the flowers and in the great web of life. But you don't hear so much about God as the other. As a matter of fact, there are some New Thought teachings that would really teach against that or look down on placing what is called sometimes a God outside of you. Have anybody of you encountered that? And so what we want to do is just withhold all, perhaps the way we've looked at it in the past and open up to this. In traditional Christianity, the focus tends to be on the second one, the very one I think unity perhaps sort of balances. But in traditional Christianity, it's more about God in the form of one of these, and we'll talk about that. So the powerful thing to remember when we look at this is that it really is all about perspective. Have you noticed that about life, is that life is the way we perceive it, that perception is reality. There's a fun story about 3 umpires, baseball umpires, that were having a dinner together, and they got in this little bit of one-upsmanship kind of competition. And the first one said, well, I'm a great umpire. There are balls and there are strikes, and I call them as I see them. And the second one said, well, I'm a great umpire. There are balls and there are strikes, and I call them as they are. And the third one said, well, no. I am a great umpire. There are balls and there are strikes, but till I call them, they ain't nothing. But it's all about perception and what we call it and how we see it. And so as we explore this, last week we talked about, is your God big enough? God is the great cosmic web of life, God in all things. But that's not necessarily a warm and fuzzy God. Today, the second week, we're going to talk about the warm and fuzzy God. In thinking and preparing for this week, I thought, the whole thing about is your God close enough, and God is the second person. There's so many scriptures that talk about this. If you look in the Bible, in Psalms 139, it says, I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up into heaven, you are there. If I go down into the grave, you are there. And it goes on and on. It just talks about wherever I go, you are there. Very much an I and a you, the other. Joshua says, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Again, this God that is with us wherever we go. And then in Hebrews, you've probably heard this, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. Those words as if they were coming to you from a God, and very comforting. Interestingly enough, I pulled out the revealing word, which is something that Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, he believed that the Bible represented aspects of our spiritual unfolding, and the names in the Bible and the places represented states of being within all of us. And so I looked at the revealing word and I thought, well, what did Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, what did he say about God? Well, interestingly enough, he said, God is creator, the infinite, eternal. God is not person, but principle. That's clearly the third person. But then he said, God is approachable, available to all who draw nigh unto him. That's very much the second person. And then he went on to say, God is personal to us when we recognize God as our indwelling life. That's God in the first person. Charles Fillmore was sort of wordy. Ernest Holmes was much more succinct. Ernest Holmes said it this way, God is all there is. God is right where I am one with God. Can you see the three there? So we actually find them in New Thought. And I'm excited about this series because it gives us an opportunity to look at ways that maybe we've sort of thrown out the baby with the bathwater in some ways because of growing up perhaps in a tradition that any of you had a God that was always watching you and judging you? Were any of you pretty sure you were going to hell at any moment in time? If that... Yeah, so a lot of us grew up with that. And many people were taught that Jesus is the only Son of God and that you have to worship Jesus, and if you don't worship Jesus, you're going to hell. And so for a lot of people, having that kind of embodiment of God became a block at some point, or a turnoff. And for some it works and still works, and for some it doesn't. The goal is to be able to see God through all these lenses and to not lock in to any one of these. Robert Brummett, who's a Unity minister, he's a writer, he's one of the teachers at Unity Institute, he's a great professor. he wrote in an article talking about the three faces of God back in 2014, he said, "It is not that God has three faces, rather we have three ways of facing God." The three ways known to us as the writer's voice is God as self, the first person me. God is the great other, the second person you. And God is the source of all creation, the great it, so to speak. And he went on to talk about how that when we get into God as the second person, this is where the ego can get really tripped up. And the ego doesn't necessarily like to surrender or to bow to something greater. But for many of us, we have been taught that we had to surrender to something that didn't feel authentic. And so he says that failing to really embrace and practice God in the second person allows sometimes for the ego to remain overinflated. That the second person can help us bring that into balance in all perspectives. So we look at all three of these today. When I was thinking about God, kind of in how God is pictured and shows up in different traditions, I was reminded of something I read a few years ago. Here's the story. It says, a burglar broke into a house one night, and he shone his flashlight around looking for valuables. When the burglar picked up a CD player to place it in his sack, a strange, disembodied voice echoed from the dark saying, "Jesus is watching you." He nearly jumped out of his skin, clicked his flashlight off, and froze. Wondering, did I hear this in my head or was it something real? Shaking his head, it got quiet. So he turned his flashlight back on and proceeded to take more valuables. Again, he heard clear as a bell, "Jesus is watching you." This time he shone his light around frantically looking for the source of the voice, and in the corner of the room, the flashlight beam rests on a parrot. "Did you say that?" he said to the parrot. "Yes," the parrot confessed. "I'm just trying to warn you." The burglar relaxed. "Warn me? I don't believe in that mumbo-jumbo Jesus is watching me. Who do you think you are anyway?" "Moses," the parrot replied. "Moses," the burglar laughed. "What kind of stupid people would name their parrot Moses?" The bird replied, "The same stupid people that would name their Rottweiler Jesus. Turn around." So let's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't always know what it means. So today when we look at God as the beloved, the other, when we sing hymns, forms of devotion are all built around this God that we are in relationship with and to. You know, sometimes I find when people come to unity and they begin to practice affirmative prayer and God is the great presence within me, all that I am is God, they'll sometimes come to me and say, "Well, I don't know how to pray anymore. If I'm not praying to a God outside of me, where do I direct my prayers? If I'm just directing them to me, then I'm in a mess. I don't know what to do." Have you ever found yourself kind of getting confused? Well, that's very natural when we're trying to find our way and seeing all three of these faces of God. So the question is your God close enough? And the second face of God is what makes God really real. Is your God close enough is about just that. Is your God real? There's a story of a little boy, Eric Butterworth, the Unity minister, wrote in one of his books about a little boy woke up one night and he had a dream and he was frightened. So he called out to his mother, and his mom came into his room, and he said, "Mom, will you stay with me? I'm scared." And she said, "Honey, God is always with you. You don't ever have to be scared." He said, "I know that, Mom, but right now I need someone with skin on." That there's those times we just need to be able to hold on to it. And that's what these do for us. My partner, we were talking about what God represents. This is her bunny. It's missing an eye. You wouldn't want to smell it. It's not bad. It's been loved. But my partner grew up in a family that didn't go to church, didn't really talk about God. And so as a child growing up, there was really no frame for God, but something in her always, always prayed. She was the person that worried about the other family members and was the one that was the little bitty prayer warrior, one of the youngest in the family. And so this was the first little animal she was ever given. And if you ask her, what is God to you? Well, it's the bunny. Because this bunny held prayers. This bunny held the hurt, the pain, the joy. That this was a tangible item that connected her with a sense of belief and believing. Now, second service, I put it back in there, I think a little bit too hard, and I got some feedback, so I'm going to give it back very gently. Bunny is just hanging in there. Yeah, I kind of threw it, I think. But when I was thinking about that, there's something called object permanence. Now, if any of you are educators or psychologists, you're probably familiar with this term. Some parents may be. Because if you sometimes with little children go through a phase where if their mom or dad is not around, they just start crying. They have separation anxiety. You're familiar with that? If the child cannot see a parent, they cry. They're afraid. Well, it's because with young children, if I can't see it, I can't hold the concept that it's still around. And so I feel abandoned. I feel alone. But what begins to happen as a normal part of our development, something eventually naturally begins to happen, typically, which is called object permanence. And what that means is I can begin to hold it within me even though I don't see it. I grow up and I finally get to a point that I can go off to school and be okay because I know that mom and dad, or mom and dad are dead, that they're home. I can go away and still rest assured that I have a home. That I carry these things, I carry them permanent within me. I can hold the idea within me even when I'm not there. That's the great value in God in the second person. That's why it is so powerful and I believe so essential. And I believe we're being called back to perhaps consider how have we sort of rejected this way, and in the process we're missing that felt sense of comfort, of compassion, of love, of those things that we need. So this week I looked around my house, and between my house and my office, I realized I have a lot of objectified gods around here. I borrowed a crystal from the prayer chaplains and a couple things from Reverend Christie's office. But you know, some people can identify with the Buddha and feel a very spiritual connection. In certain Buddhist traditions, one of the methods of meditation is that you sit and you meditate with an image of the Buddha over your head. And what happens in a period of time, over time, is the Buddha will eventually come down and be inside of you. That you go from communion to union to identification with. That's where all of these can bring us and give us a real felt sense of support and of comfort. For many, many people, Jesus is a beautiful icon. For many people, Mother Mary. For others, it may be Kuan Yin. And, you know, for some of us, you may get to a point to say, well, I don't need any of those, but now I rely on my Doreen Virtue angel cards. Anybody have your angel cards? Or it's like, oh, no, I don't have any of these, but when I need guidance, I may go down to my pendulum and seek guidance. And so, however, for some it may be the Bible, the Quran. There are many different things that we can touch that are just at a touchstone. In some traditions, in the Hindu tradition, the Hindus actually believe in one overarching God, one power, one presence. But then there are things like Ganesh, remember the elephant? Or there's different characters, so to speak, that embody one aspect. Ganesh is the remover of obstacles. And so those icons help individuals connect with a certain part of the divinity, and over time connect with a certain part of their divinity. So there's great value in being able to pour your heart out, to express. To me, the most trying times in my life, I find myself going back to that prayer that says, oh God, help me. Can you relate? It's just like you just pour your heart out. So having this felt sense of connection is the first thing that when we ask the question, is our God close enough? Is it real? And to ask yourself, is there anything that has come between me and a sense of the God of my being real for me. And to be willing to reconsider some of these ways and these things, because remember, we're not saying this is the only way. We're saying this is only one of the ways to approach. And over time, you'll find that you can hold all of these at one time. And it's an incredible feeling when that begins to happen, because you truly do have that sense of never being alone. So is your God real enough for you? The second thing, when we think about in our God being close enough, is your God a real source of support, of strength, of comfort, of help? One of the most powerful, what I believe, spiritual ways of transforming a life is known as a 12-step program. And many people find their way into unity in churches, and many different churches, through some sort of a 12-step program. Because what happens on that path is an individual finds themselves, it says in the big book, in the AA book, so it is by circumstances rather than by any virtue that we have been driven to AA, have admitted defeat, have acquired the rudiments of faith, and now want to make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to a higher power. You see, this idea of a higher power can work for an atheist or a Baptist or a Pentecostal or a New Thought, because a higher power can take on the form of many different things. But no one can deny that there is power in the higher power. Because anyone that has really walked that step and worked that path has realized that they within themselves could not. It was not working. They were not able to break free of an addiction or to have the kind of life that they wanted. But by laying hold of the idea that there is a higher power, I don't have to do it with the wherewithal that I can muster up, but I surrender to the higher power. Surrender is a word that comes up in this part of relationship with the divine. And I don't know about you, but my first understanding of surrender was when my cousin Daryl, who's just 18, like he's a day and a half older than me. Anyway, I remember playing a game with Daryl, and I beat him. And I was sort of boasting that I beat him, because he was like a day and a half older than me. I beat him. And he said, well, I'm stronger than you. I could beat you at anything like that. And I'm smarter than you, he said. And I said, well, you may be smarter or not. You may be stronger or not. At which time he proceeded to put me in a headlock until I said, uncle, so to speak. That was my idea and introduction to surrender. And it didn't feel very good, but I've learned that spiritual surrender is not bad at all. And it was kind of funny, because when I was pulling these things out and the idea of surrender and devotion was coming to me, I had some resistance. And then this literally fell down. And I thought, okay, so you want to come. And so I got this years ago at Unity Village. I've got a couple of things by this artist. I just love this. It speaks to me. Well, so I turned it over. Guess what the painting's called? Surrender. That was my lesson, in that there's power. There's something, the most powerful thing we can do is when we authentically surrender, not giving up, but opening up. It's opening up. It's hanging on with everything I've got and saying, I don't know how to do this, but there isn't something within me that does know how. There's a power and presence that is always available to me that does know how. That's the power of surrender and of opening up. So is our God close enough? Is our God high enough when it comes to higher power? If you've been around Unity very long, you've probably heard something called the prayer of protection. It goes like this. If you know it, say it with me. The light of God surrounds me. The love of God enfolds me. The power of God protects me. The presence of God watches over me. Wherever I am, God is, and all is well. Wherever I am, God is. Now that prayer was written, you may not know, it was written by James Dillett Freeman, a Unity minister who at the time was in charge of Silent Unity. And this prayer was written in 1940. Now what was happening in 1940? World War II. And so we're in World War II. And for the first time in many people's lives, they did not feel safe. And they wanted a prayer that made them feel protected. And so he penned those words that say, the light of God surrounds me. The love of God enfolds me. The power of God protects me. The presence of God watches over me. Wherever I am, God is. Wherever I am, God is. The prayer became so popular, was known by many, many people. In 1969, Edwin, known as Buzz Aldrin, took a copy of that with him to the first Apollo to the moon. There is a copy of that prayer on the moon. That it's very, very powerful because it speaks of that wherever I am, God is. There's something very comforting in that, to know that wherever I am, God is, that God is available all the time, wherever I am. So is your God close enough? Is your God real enough? And is your God powerful enough, higher power, that you can really call on and will help? Richard, would you give us this song? The third point then in asking, is your God close enough? Is your God real enough? In the scriptures, we're taught most easily that God is love. Love. God is love. And so to really entertain this, is your God close enough, is to really open up to, is your God love enough, loving and accepting enough? Can you really feel that love? You know, if love really touches you, if love really gets to you, it gets you, it changes you, it shifts you. Something happens. And if a love that comes from this sense of source, the beloved comes to you, well, I mean, it really shifts you. You begin to hold it, you embody it, you presence it. There's a website that has beautiful writings, and it's called BeliefNet. A woman wrote an article titled, "Young Children Have a Natural Hotline to the Divine." She said, one winter's day, I sat at the kitchen table with my daughter, who was then 3 years old. Outside, big round snowflakes started to fall. My 3-year-old daughter said, "Look, Mommy, the angels are shaking their pillows and the feathers are falling." Fortunately, she didn't wait for a reply. "And look, God sent down a letter," she added. "It's on the windowsill. What do you think it says?" "I'm not sure," I stammered. It was an imaginary letter and I could not see it. So I said, "Why don't you open the envelope and read it?" So my daughter opened the imaginary letter and read aloud, "Dear people, I hope you are having a nice time down there. I love you, God." Isn't that beautiful? The children just have this sense. It's that blue bunny connection. Kids just know that they're connected and they just feel that love. Is our God close enough, real enough, love enough? The last story, a true story. A number of years ago, there was a nonstop flight going from Seattle to Atlanta. It's a 4.5-hour flight. It was a full flight. Flight takes off on schedule, and after they've been in the air about an hour, the voice comes across the PA in the airplane and says, "We have a medical situation. Do we have a doctor or nurse on board? If so, please press your call button." Nobody responded apparently, because about 5 minutes later, the voice came on again and says, "We have a medical emergency. Do we have any medical personnel? Do we have a doctor, a nurse, an EMT, any medical professional? Please ring your call button or come to the front of the plane now." And no one moved. And just a few minutes later, the pilot came on and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize, but we have a medical emergency. We need to make an emergency landing. We're going to be landing in Denver. It's only going to take us about 30 minutes. You're not going to deboard the plane. We thank you for your cooperation." And the man on the plane said that kind of a silence went over the plane. And the plane landed, and they could see the medical personnel coming on, and they sat on the tarmac. 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, an hour and a half. After an hour and a half delay, the pilot comes back on and says, prepare for takeoff. We're now available to take off again. So as they begin to taxi and take off, the plane just begins, mumbling and grumbling. It took an hour and a half. And the flight attendant comes on and says, ladies and gentlemen, we realize that a number of you have missed your connection in Atlanta, but the airline will do everything possible to reroute you. And so people just really began to moan and groan out loud. And then the pilot came on and said, and one other piece of information you may find helpful. We were able to get the medical help needed for the 85-year-old man that was on board. He served in World War II as a Marine. He was a war hero. He served for 4 years, and he received a congressional honor, Medal of Honor, that was signed in 1945 by President Truman. This man fought and was inconvenienced for 4 years for our freedom. And I want you to know that we were able to get him the help that he's doing. I understand he's going to be okay. Thank you for your understanding. And the person who wrote the article said people just started clapping and cheering. That just like that, the atmosphere of the airplane changed. Why? Because love and compassion showed up. You see, people were able to expand and not just see the problem at hand, not just see how it affected them and their inconvenience. They were able to expand their perspective, to see from a bigger view. And in so doing, love came in. Compassion came in. I believe the power in realizing that there is a power and a presence that is available to us. We can cry to it. We can speak to it. We can relate in any way that we want. Because this power is love. And what we are really seeking is love. And if an airplane can open up and change like that, I believe a whole state of people can open up and change. I believe a country can change. I believe our world can change and is changing as we're able to open up big enough to hold these ideas that will always make room for love. So where in your life are you being called to open up to that God that is close enough, that is real enough, that is a higher power that's enough, that wherever you are, that God is, and that is always loving and accepting enough? I invite you to join me in a song that I believe says this beautifully, Right Where I Am. Right where I am, I couldn't be any closer. Right where I am, the presence of God is holding me. Right where I am. I invite you to sing it with me. Right where I am, I couldn't be any closer. Right where I am, the presence of God is holding me. Right where I am. I invite you to close your eyes. To notice your breath. In the same manner that you would sit on the edge of the ocean and just simply watch the waves roll in. Some waves are shallow and some are high and long. As we bear witness to our own breath, we begin to notice that some are shallow and some are deep and long. So Becoming this witness is not in trying to change it. It's becoming aware. And in this place of awareness, we notice how our breath, we breathe in and we are expanded. Literally, our body shifts. And then we exhale, and our body moves with that. The spirit is real. This breath is real. As long as we're in this bodily form, this breath is moving us, is breathing us. And this spirit and breath are one and the same word at their root. One and the same word with God. We can never be apart from this presence. And this week we become attuned to God incarnate, God in form in every being that we see. We give consideration to an icon or a picture of being. What can we see as an embodiment, a representation of divinity, of the divine? How can we allow that representation, that object, to open us that we may hold more of what's available to us? The love that is always there may flow freely. Fillmore, the co-founder and known as the Mother of Unity, often visualized, she would often put an empty chair across from her. And she would visualize Jesus in that chair. She would have conversation. She would talk. She would share her concerns. She would open up to the guidance, to the loving presence that could be felt. She never lost sight of God as the great web of life, nor God as the great eternal I amness within her. But she found great value in this practice. She also often prayed this prayer that says, God is my help in every need. God does my every hunger feed. God walks beside me, guides my way through every moment of this day. I am now wise, I am now true, present and kind and loving too. All things I am, can do and be through Christ the truth that lives in me. May we be open to the beloved, to love, that felt sense of being supported and loved and nurtured and heard. May we be guided. And may this love always open us to be a greater presence of love. And may we know that wherever I am, God is. And with my soul, all is well. Right where I am, I couldn't be any closer The presence of God is holding me right where I am. I invite you to wiggle your fingers and your toes and to open your eyes. To hopefully feel a closer connection and to sense. Open your heart and let this song, let us sing it. Right where I am, I couldn't